Okay, so my name is José Freitas. I work at for Aptoid. We are an App Store provider for Automotive AOSP. Been working on Android Automotive for the last 6 years. So first 5 years on the OEM side, then I moved to the App Store provider. So I know a bit the challenges that the OEMs face as well, because I've been inside and also because I see the challenges also on the other side as an App Store provider. I'll also provide you our view of the ecosystem, talk a bit about what is gas, non-gas, what are the challenges, also the opportunities, and introduce the COVESA role here to avoid fragmentation. Chris has been involved in some of the meetings at COVESA. COVESA is an alliance of automotive OEMs, tier 1s, tier 2s, companies working in this ecosystem. It's a slowly moving organization, but I believe it's important, especially at the early stage of this kind of new ecosystems. And we'll talk also a bit about the opportunities, but also the challenges for the app developers to bring their apps to the automotive. Okay, so let's start with explaining a bit. I mean, some of the folks here are probably familiar with this, but there's sometimes some confusion about what is Google built-in, what's Android Automotive, why do we call Automotive AOSP to what we're doing. So we have, generically speaking, 2 big flavors of Android Automotive systems, the ones that are going with Google built-in, which have Google Automotive Service, and the ones that don't have Google services. And typically what happens is that the OEMs need to replace the Google Automotive Services by something else. And we're talking about mainly 3 main components: the navigation app, an app store, an apps market, and voice assistant, and some services that might need to support the apps running. We operate on the non-gas, let's say, ecosystem, but as participants on the ecosystem, our objective is that we have as much compatibility as possible, also to provide bigger scale to the app developers and to attract more developers to this ecosystem. But we'll talk about a bit the fragmentation risks and the problems that we see ahead. So we are trying to build a platform, an ecosystem. As a platform, we have, of course, the network effects. The more OEMs we bring to our platform, the more attractive it gets for the third-party apps, and the other way around. The more content we get, the more the OEMs are interested. So it is, of course, on everybody's best interest that the ecosystem grows in a sustainable, non-fragmented, and healthy way. And we're trying to do our part because we are here in the middle, connecting the developers to the OEMs and making sure that everybody runs smoothly on the OEM platform. So today, we already have a few OEMs working with us that are live. There are just a few here. Volkswagen was our first project in Latin America. For the worldwide launch, they're now working with our competitor Arman, the Ignite store. We launched also BMW, Mercedes, Lotus. These are some of the OEMs that are live. So we're already gaining some traction and some scale here in terms of ecosystem. And we're launching several other OEMs this year and the next one. And in general, and generally speaking, I've seen on the previous meetup a very pessimistic view from Ioanni from Snap. I must tell you that in general, we build once and deploy everywhere. It's not like we're building different flavors of the apps for the different OEMs. That's exactly what we want to avoid with this new ecosystem. I mean, I give the example here of Spotify because it's probably one of the most popular apps on the automotive landscape. And they were used to build custom integrations for each OEM on the old days. And now I can tell you that they are quite happy with the fact that they can pick a single APK and distribute to different OEMs, be it through our store, through Google Store, or through Arman Ignite store. And that's actually what we want at the end, that everything is compatible. But the audio apps, it's probably the most stable and standardized category of driver distraction optimized apps. So this is, let's say, these are the easy ones. And as we'll see later, there are other categories of apps which are a bit more complex to handle, but at least on the audio templated ones, the integrations have been quite smooth. And as we can see here from the different screenshots, so the way it works is that the OEMs provide the media player. So the third-party app, it's only a media service that connects to the media player through the media browser service. And you can see the app integrating with the different media players from the different OEMs. And everything runs smoothly. Of course, we are here in the middle doing the initial validation of the apps for the OEMs to make sure that everything is stable. However, I mean, the ecosystem is still maturing. So this is a bit my perspective. Not sure if everybody agrees. I'm happy to discuss this afterwards. So, but in my perspective, I believe the operating system itself, it's already quite mature. Of course, I mean, Google is adding more features and more features. And what we see is that the OEMs are having a hard time trying to catch up. So first, most of them are launching their first Android automotive platforms. So they're still learning. And second, they are probably not ready yet to upgrade regularly the Android version. So they're having a hard time launching their first platforms, and sometimes they lack a plan for the long-term upgrade of the Android versions. Also, on the third-party app side, and again, excluding the audio streaming category, which is quite stable, we still see some lack of maturity. So everybody's still learning, the app developers, the OEMs, and ourselves, and we're trying to guide everybody in the best way that we can. And finally, what I mean here by user choice is that if we look at the consumer electronic, you may have millions of apps on an app store, and it's up to the user to select which apps they want. We're not there yet in the automotive. So the selection of apps is still curated by the OEMs. There's a strong validation on top of these platforms to make sure that everything is safe and safe for driving and secure. So we cannot tell that we will be in the short term in a similar situation that we are today with the consumer electronic, where the user will have all the apps available and they will be the ones selecting. Currently, it's the OEMs that are selecting which apps are being distributed to which platform, which means that sometimes we as, let's say, as distributors, we have lots of apps that are submitting, but then sometimes the OEMs don't pick all these apps, and it's really not our decision. We try to influence the OEMs and guide them in the best way, but it's not yet an ecosystem where the user will have the final word on the app selection. The fact that the platforms and the apps are not yet very mature requires more effort, particularly on our side that are in the middle, on the validation and on the bug reporting and the retesting to make sure that everything is ready to go live. Also, I mean, this is a challenge that we have. It's slightly different from if we compare with the cars with Google built-in. So the cars with Google built-in usually have much more standardized platforms. They go through the complete Android CTS, VTS. They are full Android automotive. In our case, we work with OEMs with different flavors of Android. So we may have pure Android automotive, which has systems that have all the car APIs and all the car features. But we also have some adaptations from mobile AOSP with some parts of the car API. We have systems which are fully Android, and we have containerized solutions that use hypervisors that run other operating systems and Android on a container. The Android versions, we also have a big variety, even though we are operating only for in the last few years, we already see a big variability in terms of versions of Android. So we see AAOS already releasing 15, but we have OEMs that are still preparing to roll out versions of Android 9. Some of them are already on 13, others are still on 9. So there's a big gap in terms of functionality, especially if you look at the automotive in terms of features that are available between an Android 9 and an Android 14 or 15. So this is a big challenge also for us. And again, as I mentioned previously, not all the OEMs are prepared to do the regular updates of their Android versions. So this is a big challenge also for us and for the OEMs. Okay, so where do we see some risk of fragmentation? So if we look at the approach that Google is taking, especially on the driver distraction optimized apps, they're taking this approach of the templated apps that with some adaptations, they will be able to run on Android Auto and Android Automotive. This is an interesting value proposition for the app developers because the reach of Android Auto is much wider in terms of number of devices compared to Android Automotive. But it also creates lots of constraints in some categories of apps that we'll see later. On our case, we only work on Android Automotive, of course. We don't work with the projected modes Android Auto. And for different reasons that we'll see later, we don't promote as much all the categories that Google is promoting, at least not in the same way. And I'll try to explain you why. Okay, so if we look at the landscape of categories of apps that Google define, we can group it in these three main categories. We have the templated ones, media, and the ones that use car app library. These categories of apps on the left are to be used while driving. And we have the apps to be used while parked or for passenger or for rear seat, gaming, video, and browsers. So on the audio apps, although these are templated, the template is well known. There's no risk of fragmentation. Everything runs smoothly. On the parked apps, the apps that are not to be used while driving, we don't see a major risk of fragmentation either because these are usually simple adaptations from tablet versions or from mobile phone versions. We don't see a big risk there. Where we see a risk is in some categories of apps that require the car apps library. The car apps library is a framework built by Google that allows the apps to be distraction optimized, so safe to be used while driving. It creates some constraints, but it also provides a safe framework for the app developers. And we see here these different categories of apps: navigation, points of interest, weather, Internet of Things, and communication. It's still a new category, still in beta phase, I believe. And it's on this category of apps that we see more risk of fragmentation between gas and non-gas ecosystems. Okay, so trying to go a bit deeper into what does it mean using the car apps library. So using this framework that was built by Google for Android Auto and Automotive, the apps that want to use this car apps library, they require an automotive app host to run on the system. So the automotive app host is responsible for running the app. And for instance, if we're talking about apps that need to render a map, it's the app host that will render the map. It's not the third-party app itself. So this is completely different from the mobile world in terms of implementation. It provides a safe framework for the app developers, but it also creates lots of constraints. And if we look at the app host that is needed to render the maps, what we see, for instance, is that we have a version for gas, so Google built in. This is not the AOSP, so it's only for the OEMs that are running gas, which renders the maps using Google Maps. But then if we go to the AOSP repo, what we have is a vanilla version of this automotive app host app, but there's no map there. It's just a black screen. So if the OEMs want to use the apps that need this automotive host, they will need to bridge this gap and bring the maps into this automotive app host. We've provided a working version for this based on OpenStreetMaps for testing the apps, but usually the approach that the OEMs prefer is to have the same look and feel between the navigation app and the third-party apps that will need to render the maps. So if we're rendering the automotive host with OpenStreetMaps, but then we have a navigation map that uses TomTom with a completely different look and feel, it will look a bit weird for the end user having the points of interest with one look and feel and then the navigation app with a different one. So we support this for app testing, but we've seen on the OEMs that we work with, at least, some resistance to adopt this category of apps. Okay, so the car apps library. So for us, it's a bit the elephant in the room because it's what is creating some fragmentation for the apps that we work with. So what is the motivation or the lack of motivation, I would say, on the OEM side, on the third-party apps, to adopt this car apps library? So on the OEM side, the problem lies, it's mostly related to the fact that they already have a navigation app that they work with. And these navigation apps usually don't support this template approach from Google. Also, again, usually attached to the navigation app, you will have all the location-based service, the points of interest. So most of the times, there's not much interest from the OEMs on bringing additional third-party apps with a different technology to provide more location-based service and more map content. And again, the problem is that most of the OEMs are not doing this extra step of adapting the automotive app host to work with their navigation app provider. So if the OEMs are not doing this, it becomes also less interesting for the third-party apps that work on this category of apps. In addition to that, the complaints that we heard from the third-party app developers is that there's too much constraints on what they can do with the templates, and they don't have they have limited branding visibility. So they cannot brand the apps properly. So if you pick 2 or 3 points of interest apps, they will look very similar to each other. And from the third-party apps developers, this is a limitation. We've seen that Google announced at the I/O some improvements on the car apps library. We haven't researched it yet. Hopefully it gets a bit better. But these are the main reasons why we're seeing some resistance both on the OEMs and on the third-party apps to adopt, in particular, these categories of templated apps. So what we're seeing is that for these particular categories of apps, the points of interest, the navigation, weather apps, we sometimes have 2 flavors of the app, even in our app store. So we would have the templated version for the OEMs that are able to run the template, and we would have the templateless version for the OEMs that don't have the template. But most of the OEMs that we work with don't support this kind of template. Okay, so I explained a bit the context and where we see the bigger risks of fragmentation and which categories of apps. I'll now go into explaining a bit what is COVESA and what's the role of COVESA to avoid, I wouldn't say completely avoid fragmentation, but at least avoid further fragmentation. So the COVESA Alliance, the COVESA is organized in expert groups. There was a new one created last year for this particular topic, the Automotive AOSP framework. And we call it Automotive AOSP and not Android Automotive because we don't have the Android certification, so we cannot tell that our systems are Android systems. But technically speaking, they are very similar to an Android automotive without gas. And the COVESA objective is not to replace a gas. So the objective of COVESA is just to bridge the gap. So whenever there's something that the apps need that require Google services, we want to provide a replacement. Or if we want to define a different approach, at least ensure that there's a common understanding for non-gas OEMs, and at least outside of the gas world, everybody is following a similar approach. And also in some cases to clarify some topics which might be unclear from the official AAOS documentation. And an example that came up recently was the camera API. So there's lots of, there's a camera 2 API framework provided by Google, defining the different cameras that can be available on the car. But the OEMs didn't know which one should they pick as a default camera, for instance, if they have a video conferencing app. So this is the kind of things that COVESA tries to do. And 2 of the examples of topics that you are picking is the push notifications, because push notifications require on Android mobile Google services, and the reverse geocoding, same reason. There's Google services dependencies. So I'll give you an example of one of our, for us, it's a breakthrough because we know that these alliances are slow. So although we've been working on this for almost a year, for us, it's already a breakthrough that we reached an agreement between the different OEMs on how should the push notifications be done. So what was agreed within COVESA is that we will pick the unified push approach with some adaptations proposed by COVESA, which the unified push team agreed to increase the security, provide VAPID, voluntary application identification, encryption, and compatibility with web push. And this will be, let's say, the adopted solution by the COVESA OEMs for the push notifications. The advantage of this solution is that actually it gives flexibility to the OEM. So the OEMs can select which server that they want to use as push server, which distribution app they want to use, and it's still compatible with all the third-party apps. The third-party apps just built once for non-gas, of course, for this kind of systems, and they don't need to worry about the specificities of each OEM. And the rationale for this particular topic was because it's needed for communication apps. So even on gas systems, the communication apps are being proposed, are on beta stage, but at least from the public documentation, they won't be able to receive incoming calls. It's only for outgoing. So for the incoming calls, we need this push notifications mechanism. And we're trying in this particular case to be already a bit ahead of what Google is doing. And yeah, where we are today is that there's a solution, technical solution agreed. There's a POC which implements the COVESA spec on top of the unified push, and the participants are gathering funding to implement the proposed modifications on the unified push side. Okay, we talked a bit about fragmentation, the ecosystem. I'll talk briefly with the app developers. What are the opportunities and the challenges? So what an app developer needs to bring an app to the car? So this is very generic approach. There's more details here on the presentation, also on the Google and our documentation. So first, the app developers need to decide which category of apps they want to build. This is the first thing. And second, do they want to go the templated or the non-templated approach? And here it's already a decision on fragmentation, non-fragmentation. Some app developers are actually building the two versions, one for gas, one for non-gas, with templated, non-templated. It really depends on the decision from the developers and on the resources that they may have. Bigger organizations are able to support these two approaches, but it's not the reality for all the small app developers. Then check the documentations, the APIs, the guidelines, then build the app, of course. I mean, we provide some guidelines to make sure that the apps run on non-gas systems, so the apps cannot have hard GMS dependencies, need to pay attention to some aspects like driver distractions, different screen resolutions, DRMs if applicable. And in our case particularly, we provide a list of common issues that we've seen while integrating the different apps. This could help the developers bring their apps into the cars. What we usually see is that nobody reads the documentation. I'm the same. I do the same. And sometimes when the bugs are reported, we just point to our documentation, and eventually the information is there. But it's sometimes it's too much information, and most of the developers are doing this for the first or the second time. Then validate the app. There's emulators available from Google, from Snap. We use the Snap one. Probably there will be a COVESA emulator, still working on it. And we also provide the different screen profiles from the OEMs that we work with, but there's a big variability there. And finally, submit the app for validation. And usually we do a thorough validation process of the app. We test on, let's say, generic reference platforms. And then we will also test on each of the OEM specific platforms. So all the issues that we find, we usually report back to the developers, and we usually provide lots of support to make sure that everything runs smoothly. So when we're talking, so I mentioned previously that we need to decide template or non-templated approach. I mean, the app developers that go the non-templated approach but want to build distraction optimized apps, this can be quite complex. So they need to make sure that they read all the documentation about how to consume the driving state, that they're building they're designing their app properly for driving, taking into account the number of interactions, the touch area, font sizes, layout spacing, and this requires lots of manual validation on our side. To be honest, there's some challenges in terms of scalability with this approach, because if all the apps are going this way, it's challenging to make sure that all of them are safe for driving. But at least currently we support this because we know that the app developers are a bit in a dilemma if they go only with the template or with the non-templated approach. But with this approach, they have a bit more freedom. Validating the app may be challenging. I mean, just on our documentation, we provide 14 different screen profiles from different OEMs. Then we have the challenge that some OEMs are not live yet, so they don't want to disclose their profiles. So we cannot tell here publicly on the site which profile corresponds to which OEM. Usually we communicate this in privately to the app developers. But we're talking with the OEMs, especially the ones that are already in production, to make this information publicly visible to the app developers. So if the app developers want to test specifically for Mini or for Lotus, they will be able to select the right hardware profile. And this requires importing on the Android Studio emulator the different profiles that we provide. The good news that we didn't test it yet, but Google announced recently at the Google I/O that there's a new emulator tool that allows more easily the app developers to simulate the different screen sizes and shapes. I think this is good news for the developers, but we haven't tested this yet. But my expectation is that this will be useful. So I provide here a few references in terms of documentation, emulators, some OEM-specific emulators that are on the official Android documentation. And yeah, feel free to reach out and ask questions. Okay, I can pick them by order.
Hey, good.
We have first one from Antoine regarding the security updates. So, I mean, the OEMs are still learning how to handle this Android ecosystem. So eventually they'll bring the security updates, and they have over-the-air updates, most of them. So they can bring the security updates to the existing platforms, but they're still learning how to really handle this long-term regular update of the Android version for their existing platform. So what we're seeing sometimes is that they launch with one Android version and they only look into newer Android versions for a slightly different model or platform. But there's still like this kind of, let's say, the Apple approach that you can get very old devices that run very recent operating systems. This is still lacking, and the OEMs are far from reaching this point, but they're learning. So it's not that there's no security updates, it's just like it's slower than on a normal, let's say, mobile manufacturer. Then we have a question from Michelle regarding the car-ready mobile apps. I'm not sure if you noticed.
Yeah.
It's actually quite an interesting announcement from Google. So the question is whether it will contribute to the fragmentation. I actually believe it's the other way around. So some of the challenge that we face sometimes is to convince the app developers to build apps to automotive, because in terms of volume, it seems very small compared to the mobile world. So if Google is doing this work to more easily bring apps from non-automotive to automotive, we will get more content. So at the end, of course, we will need to chase those apps that are already on gas and were validated by Google. So it's more work on our team to go after the apps. But I think it's actually good for the ecosystem. And if you think about it, we are actually competing with the projected modes on the Android Automotive. So the users have the alternative of using the mobile phone or the embedded systems. And Google announced this program for Android Automotive, not for Android Auto. So I think it's actually good for our Android Automotive ecosystem to bring more content to the cars. And we'll benefit from this work from Google because they have a huge platform with lots of apps. So it will be easier for them to identify which will be the good candidates to bring to automotive. Hopefully, of course, I mean, then we'll have to contact these apps and try to bring them to our platform. If there's not that many Google Services dependencies, hopefully it will be simple. So we have a question also for Alvaro, from Alvaro, if we do the validation for all the third-party apps. So currently, yes. So unfortunately, that is the case because the systems are not yet mature. So we test all the apps that are released on all the OEMs platforms, with one or two exceptions where the OEMs do the validation themselves. Of course, this is not scalable in the long term. Our expectation is that as we get more trust on the platforms and as we reach what we call the long tail apps, the OEMs won't request that much validation on these kind of apps.
I mean, how many apps are we talking about at the moment?
Around 200. Yeah.
Okay.
Some of them with regular updates, others one update per year. It really depends a bit. And of course, some of them are more.
That is, it's feasible to handle that manually at the moment, I guess.
I mean, we have some automation, especially regression tests automated. We always need to do some kind of manual validation anyway, but we already do lots of automation to scale a bit more the process. But eventually, as time goes by, we won't be able to validate everything. We have a question regarding the Apex. So I'm not familiar with this topic, but I believe since Android 13, at least the Android car framework can be updated through an Apex module independently of the Android platform version, but I'm not 100% sure about this. I'm not an expert on this topic. And finally, I have a question from Joanne regarding it's actually an interesting one regarding the truck manufacturers and heavy equipment manufacturers. So I think where we are today with the trucks, I mean, on any kind of platform, we always have a chicken and an egg problem. We need users and to convince the content providers, and we need content to convince the users. And I think with the trucks, we are on the early stage. So we are still on this chicken and egg. We are talking with some OEMs, but they need content. And the providers of, for instance, truck solutions or fleet management solutions, they want commitment from the OEMs to invest on Android Automotive. So it's a chicken and egg problem, but we see a big potential there, particularly because there's lots of things that you do today that you need to install hardware equipment to read some signals from the cars or the trucks that you would be able to get with a standardized Android Automotive platform. So I think it's an area where we get quickly scale. And from the business perspective, it's an area where we get more willingness to pay because the fleet operators will be willing to pay to save money, to save some costs on the operation of their platforms. But we are still, I would say, on the early stages for this markets. And also the life cycle of this equipment, it's much longer than a passenger car. So usually you're talking about 15, 20 or even more years. So it's not that you get very frequent updates of the devices, but definitely there's a big potential there. We're looking into it, and we noticed that Google is preparing the platform to support telemetry data, vehicle OEM diagnostics. So there's lots of service being added on Android 14 and 15 that will help support these truck manufacturers and heavy equipment manufacturers. I'm not sure if I answered all the questions or not.
I think that's all the ones that I spotted. As soon as on that subject, I think Google is not particularly interested in trucks. So it probably is a good area for the non-gas people to focus on.